Hey guys, tonight, we re-wandering into one of the weirdest corners of medieval life. The strange things people actually did for fun. Spoiler alert, there were no phones, no Netflix, and definitely no escape rooms. So, what did people do? Well, they raced pigs, wrestled for cheese, and apparently, farting contests were a valid form of entertainment. It was a world where boredom met creativity in the most unpredictable ways. So before you get too cozy, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this strange little corner of quiet storytelling. And drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's strangely comforting to know who else is drifting off with us around the world. Now, get comfortable, let the day melt away, and we'll drift back together into the quiet corners of the past. The sun rolled slowly over the hills like a lazy egg, spilling golden yolk across the damp rooftops of a village too old to remember its own name. Smoke curled from crooked chimneys, not in any real hurry, and the mud in the streets squelched with the sort of noise that made you question your life choices if your barefoot landed in it. And somewhere in the distance, the rooster didn't crow. He was awake, he just didn't feel like it. Perhaps he had laryngitis or an existential crisis, or maybe, after watching the same people trip over the same bucket every morning for the past 3 years, he decided to boycott the whole charade. Whatever the reason, the silence was noticeable, which made the sound of the baker's boy falling off a stool all the more dramatic. A loud thud, followed by a string of words he'd absolutely deny saying in front of his mother, echoed through the dim bakery. He rubbed the side of his head and blamed the oven for existing. The bakery itself was still warm from yesterday's coals, and the air inside smelled like sleep, old flour, and someone's forgotten sock. A lump of dough sat stubbornly on the counter, a pale, dimpled thing refusing to rise out of pure, yeasty spite. And the baker, an old man with arms like tree trunks and a temper like a thundercloud, snored loudly behind the sacks of rye. This wasn't a day for grand battles or royal decrees. This was a day for, well, not much. And that's precisely where the magic happened. With nothing else to do, the villagers had to get inventive. Take Agnes, for instance. She was known throughout the village not for her weaving, but for her uncanny ability to balance a spoon on her nose while reciting scandalous rumors about the neighboring village's goat. It wasn't a useful skill, but it drew a crowd. Then there was Bartholomew, a farmer who discovered that his prize pig, Gertrude, could run surprisingly fast when chased by a turnip on a string. This accidental discovery quickly escalated into the village's annual pig race. The rules were simple: no magic, no cheating, and the pig had to cross the finish line. The turnip was optional. The winner received bragging rights and a slightly muddy wheel of cheese. Speaking of cheese, wrestling for it was a legitimate sport. Once a year, a large wheel of cheese was rolled down a dangerously steep hill, and a horde of villagers would tumble chaotically after it. The goal wasn't just to catch the cheese, it was to survive the descent with most of your limbs intact. Broken bones were common, but the glory of being the cheese champion was, apparently, worth the risk. It was a spectacle of joyous, reckless abandon. And let's not forget the art of competitive flatulence, a genuine form of entertainment documented in medieval texts. Performers, known as flatulists, could create rhythms, melodies, and even imitate animal sounds. Imagine sitting in a crowded tavern, not for a bard's song, but to listen to a man play Greensleeves in a way you never thought possible. It was crude, it was bizarre, but in a world without streaming services, it was top-tier entertainment. These weren't just distractions. They were the heartbeat of the community. They were moments of shared laughter in a life that was often difficult and short. From spoon balancing to cheese chasing, people found joy in the absurd, the simple, and the outright strange. It reminds you that creativity doesn't need a budget or a screen. Sometimes, all it needs is a bit of boredom and a very determined pig. So, as we leave this peculiar little village to its turnip chasing and cheese wrestling, maybe we can take a piece of that with us. The idea that fun doesn't have to be complicated. Imagine this: the air is damp, carrying the surprisingly delicate sound of a pig's sneeze. The village is stretching awake, one creaking joint at a time. A dog nonchalantly scratches its ear against a cartwheel. Over there, a cow named Gertrude, still lost in a dream, wanders aimlessly into a fresh line of laundry. Does anyone react? Not really. If they see it, they seem to decide it's a problem for another time, or perhaps for another person entirely. Near the central well, two elderly women are already holding court. Wrapped in thick shawls that do little to contain their strong opinions, they dissect the morning. One declares the sun is far too bright, a clear sign that something is amiss. Her companion nods sagely, adding her own theory. The rooster hasn't crowed. You see, this can only mean one of three things. Someone has died, someone is about to die, or, and she seems most certain of this one, someone forgot to properly wind up the sun last night. The exact details are a bit fuzzy, but she's convinced goats are involved somehow. As they debate the celestial mechanics, a small boy with a mop of unruly hair tiptoes past the church. His tunic is comically large, swallowing his small frame. He clutches a bucket containing a single, very judgmental-looking fish. This fish is destined for the Reeves dinner table, but the boy is currently engaged in a profound moral struggle. He's seriously contemplating eating it himself, right then and there, scales, bones, and all. The look on the fish's face isn't helping his conscience. He scurries past the tavern just as the door groans open. A bleary-eyed man stumbles out into the dawn. He's missing a boot, but he has acquired a live chicken, which he holds tucked under one arm, like a precious bundle. A single daisy is jauntily tucked behind his ear. The man looks dazed, but the chicken looks genuinely concerned about the life choices that have led it to this moment. And where is the source of all this morning anxiety? The missing rooster, high above, perched on the thatched roof of the blacksmith's shed. He surveys his kingdom. No one has bothered to name him, so he is simply the rooster. From his vantage point, he has a perfect view of the unfolding comedy. He watches the baker's young apprentice yelp after burning a finger on a hot tray. He sees a small child trip and fall into a muddy puddle. The child makes no move to get up, operating under the firm belief that if he stays put long enough, his sheer patheticness might earn him a ripe plum. It's a bold strategy. The rooster isn't the only one watching. A goat, with the cold, unblinking eyes of a seasoned philosopher, is methodically chewing on a discarded boot. It makes direct eye contact with someone's grandmother, who is staring out her window. She doesn't flinch. It's a silent, mutual acknowledgement of the village's underlying chaos. A hiss of steam erupts from the blacksmith's forge, a prelude to the day's first clang of hammer on anvil. That familiar, rhythmic sound, the daily symphony of irritation, is about to begin. But not just yet. For now, the village lingers in that magical in-between moment. It's too late for the quiet of night, but a little too early to be properly awake. It's a liminal space filled with yawns, scratched heads, and the vague memory of forgotten chores. The cows are confused. The chickens are muttering amongst themselves, probably planning a coup. Then, a new sound cuts through the quiet. The protesting squeak of cartwheels, pulled by a donkey that looks like it has witnessed the dawn of time and regretted most of it. A cart rumbles into the square. The driver is an old man with exactly 3 teeth and a laugh that seems to erupt from his very soul. He bellows, "Good morning," like a battle cry, shattering the fragile peace. And how does the village respond to this cheerful assault? With absolute silence. It's not out of rudeness, you understand. It's just that most villagers have UNT'd their first mug of mead or their invigorating mushroom tea, yet they are, as a collective, deeply suspicious of anyone exhibiting this much enthusiasm before the sun has fully cleared the horizon. This is the beauty of this place. It's a tapestry woven with grumpy grandmothers, philosophical goats, guilty children, and chickens with existential dread. It's a world that reminds us that even in the quietest corners, life is bustling with humor, character, and a healthy dose of delightful weirdness. Every yawn tells a story, and every misplaced boot is a mystery waiting to be solved. Finally, with a grunt and a flap of wings, the The rooster let out a sound that could best be described as a sneeze trapped inside a yawn. It was a pathetic, strangled squawk that echoed briefly across the rooftops before being swallowed by the morning mist. This was followed by a suspicious silence and a deeply embarrassed shuffle on the roof tiles as he tried to look nonchalant, as if that was exactly the sound he'd intended to make all along. A woman hanging laundry in the yard below looked up, her expression a perfect blend of annoyance and resignation. She muttered, "About time," before snapping a damp sheet so hard it cracked like a whip, a sound that could have doubled as a flag being unfurled for battle. And just like that, with a failed crow and a cracking sheet, the village surrendered to the day. It wasn't a grand awakening. It was more like a collective, weary groan. Boots were pulled on with grunts of effort, their leather still stiff from the cold night. Aprons, smelling faintly of old flour and wood smoke, were tied around waists. Across the village, doors creaked open, and bread, lumpy and misshapen, was shoved into clay ovens. Children, who seemed to operate on a different frequency entirely, were yelled at to stop licking the frost off the fence posts. It was a morning ritual, as reliable as the sunrise, though far less beautiful. Somewhere in the distance, a single bell rang, just once. Nobody knew why, but everyone assumed it meant something important. It was that kind of village full of unexplained noises and shared assumptions. The blacksmith, a man whose arms were thicker than most people's legs, began his day not with the clang of a hammer, but with a rhythmic string of curses aimed at a stubborn piece of iron. It was his morning prayer. Not far away, the priest, a well-meaning but slightly confused man, practiced his upcoming sermon, using a stick to gesture at a particularly unimpressed sheep. He spoke of divine grace and redemption. The sheep, in response, chewed its cud and let out a defiant baa, a clear theological disagreement. By the time the sun had finally dragged itself fully above the horizon, casting a watery, golden light over the higgledy-piggledy rooftops, the rooster had gone back to sleep. His job, as far as he was concerned, was done. He'd made a noise. People were moving. The world, however broken and ridiculous, was turning again. And if no one had quite noticed the exact moment the day began, that was fine. This wasn't the sort of place where things started cleanly. Here, mornings didn't arrive with a flourish. They shuffled in, lost a boot in the mud, and hoped no one asked too many questions. The first true scent of the morning wasn't the baking bread, which was still a distant promise. It wasn't even the wood smoke from the newly lit fires. It was the warm, wet slap of old porridge hitting a wooden bowl, a sound both comforting and slightly grim. This was immediately followed by the unmistakable temps of someone's breath who had not, by any stretch of the imagination, met a mint leaf in recent memory. In the corner of a crooked cottage, a place where right angles were merely a suggestion, the hearth gave a low grumble. Flames licked lazily at damp logs, protesting their heavy workload, sending puffs of smoke back into the room as if in defiance. Stirring a pot over this reluctant fire was a woman with one eyebrow, other lost to a baking flash years ago, and zero patience. She jabbed a wooden spoon into a cauldron that looked suspiciously like it had never been emptied, only replenished. The porridge inside bubbled with a resentful plop, thick enough to stand a spoon in. Or, if you were clever, thin enough to slide off the spoon when no one was looking. It was a substance of opportunity. Her husband, already shirtless and already sweating despite the morning chill, sat hunched over a hunk of rye bread, so dense it might qualify as a weapon in some kingdoms. He took a bite and paused halfway through, chewing, not out of delight, but pure calculation. Was this the same piece from yesterday, or had it been reincarnated from last week's loaf? He couldn't be sure. Either way, it tasted of dust and commitment, a flavor he knew well. He swallowed with a determined gulp, fueling himself for a day of hard labor that promised little reward beyond another meal of the same. Next door, a young girl with braids the color of straw was carefully pouring reused ale into a cracked clay cup for her grandfather, the old man, whose face was a roadmap of a long and difficult life. Claimed the morning ale settled the stomach, despite strong evidence to the contrary presented by his frequent groans and the concerned looks from his daughter-in-law. The girl performed the task with a solemnity usually reserved for religious ceremonies. Understanding that this small ritual was the bedrock of her grandfather's mourning, the old man took the cup in a trembling hand, downed it in one go, and let out a shuddering sigh that seemed to shake the very foundations of their small hut. He was ready for the day, or at least as ready as he was ever going to be. Meanwhile, the village's only scholar, a man named Elmsworth, who owned 3½ books, was having a crisis. His prized quill, a feather from a goose of some repute, had gone missing. He searched frantically, peering under piles of parchment and muttering about the decline of intellectual security. In his mind, this wasn't just a missing quill. It was an attack on knowledge itself. His wife, who was busy chasing a chicken out of the pantry, paid him no mind. She knew the quill was likely tucked behind his ear, exactly where he'd put it the night before. But Elmsworth's morning panic was as much a part of the village's routine as the rising sun. Out in the muddy lane that served as the main street, two neighbors were engaged in their daily, silent war. It was a war fought not with swords, but with laundry lines. Each morning, they would try to hang their washing just a little bit higher than the other, a subtle but fierce competition for the best drying air. Today, Mistress Gable had achieved a new height, using a precariously balanced pole to hoist her husband's undergarments to a truly impressive altitude. Her rival, Master Finch, could only glare from his doorway, already plotting his countermove for tomorrow. Perhaps a pulley system. The thought consumed him as he gnawed on his breakfast. This was a village where ambition was small, but no less intense for it. The children, now freed from the fence posts, had formed a ragged, noisy pack. Their game of the day involved chasing a piglet that had escaped its pen. The piglet, nimble and terrified, weaved through legs, under carts, and around barrels, with the children in hot pursuit, their laughter echoing off the damp stone walls. One of them, a small boy named Pip, tripped and landed face first in a puddle, coming up sputtering and covered in mud. He didn't cry. Instead, he let out a triumphant laugh, holding up a clump of mud as if it were a trophy. For the children, the chaos of the morning was not a trial, but an adventure playground. As the porridge was eaten, the ale drunk, and the piglet cornered, the village slowly found its rhythm. The blacksmith's curses gave way to the steady, reassuring clang of hammer on anvil. The scent of baking bread finally overpowered the smell of stale breath, a sweet, yeasty perfume that promised sustenance. The priest, having given up on the sheep, was now rehearsing his sermon to a wooden fence post, which seemed far more receptive to his theological points. The world was waking up, not with a bang, but with a series of small, interconnected actions: a spoon stirring a pot, a hammer striking iron, a child laughing in the mud, each one a tiny note in the rambling, discordant, yet somehow harmonious symphony of the village morning. Have you ever wondered what a real medieval morning was like, beyond the fairy tales of knights and princesses? Well, forget the pristine castles and sparkling crowns. Let's take a journey back in time, to a place where hygiene was more of a rumor and breakfast was an adventure in itself. As the sun peaks over the horizon, it's not the cheerful crow of a rooster that signals the start of the day. In fact, the rooster is still sulking somewhere. The day truly begins when the smoky air, thick with the smell of burning wood and salt, fills with the sounds of a village waking up. Inside a small cottage, a family gathers around a pot of porridge that's slowly turning into a substance suspiciously like glue. The ale, reused from the night before, is already at room temperature, and that is definitely not a good thing. On crooked shelves, loaves of freshly baked bread are cooling. But this isn't the artisan sourdough you see on Instagram. This bread dares you to complain. Its crust a challenge to even the strongest teeth. A cup sits on the table. It's chipped rim-shaped, uncannily, like the local bishop's nose, fact the family often points out, but never truly finds funny. Step outside, and the morning chorus is in full swing. Wood snaps and crackles in countless hearths. Metal clangs against metal, and somewhere, A desperate voice cries out, "Not again," followed by the sight of a chicken being gently tossed out of a window. The daily rituals have begun, and they are anything but glamorous. Hygiene, you asked? It was more of a suggestion, a fleeting thought one might entertain if there was a spare moment, which there rarely was. Picture this: a man, shirtless by a barrel of murky water, splashing his face with enough force to suggest he's trying to wash away his entire identity. Nearby, another man nonchalantly uses the corner of a tunic which clearly isn't his to wipe his nose. A woman vigorously scrubs her armpits with a handful of moss, muttering something that could be a prayer, a curse, or perhaps a bit of both. And what about dental care? People got creative. Chewing on willow sticks was a popular method. Others would rub ash on their gums with their fingers, wincing as the grit scraped against their teeth. One particularly brave individual swore by using sour milk, claiming it scared the rot away. It also scared away anyone attempting to have a conversation with him before noon. It was effective, just not in the way he intended. Inside a home, a small child with a spectacular mane of tangled hair tries to tame it by licking his palm and smacking his curls into place. His mother watches on, unfazed. She has bigger problems, namely, trying to discreetly remove a slug from her shoe without waking the baby strapped to her back. It's a delicate balancing act, both literally and figuratively. If there was one source of collective pride, it was the bread ovens. Though pride might be a strong word, it was more like a daily lottery. Would today's loaf crack your teeth clean off, or just chip them a little? The dough was a motley crew of whatever was on hand. Oats, barley, maybe a few forgotten seeds. Finding a walnut in your slice was like winning the jackpot. Finding a pebble, well, that was just Tuesday. At the edge of the village, a man known only as Cricket lights his stove with a knowing smirk. He's famous for his belief that singing to his dough makes the bread rise better. The bread, consistently flat and dense, seems to disagree. But Cricket's concerts continue unabated. His neighbors don't bother complaining. They just make a point of loudly enjoying bread from anyone else's oven. The morning is also dotted with sacred, and sometimes strange, rituals. A few families kneel by their doorways, murmuring blessings with half-closed eyes and fully empty stomachs. The priest's bell rings a single, solitary time, but no one's quite sure why, since he's still fast asleep in the chapel with a candle stub melted into his hair. Superstitions were as common as mud. One mother ties a string of garlic to her baby's ankle to ward off evil spirits. Another spits over her left shoulder after feeding the dog, just in case. A young boy, seeking strength for the day, rubs mud on his forehead, only to immediately trip over a bucket and blame the mud for its spectacular failure. So, this was the medieval morning. A chaotic, messy, and surprisingly resilient start to the day. It wasn't about grandeur. It was about getting by. It was the sound of a community stirring to life, one chipped cup, one questionable loaf of bread, and one launched chicken at a time. It's a world away from ours, yet in the simple, dogged determination to face the day, there's something profoundly human. In our village, life moved to a rhythm both chaotic and comforting. Everyone had a part to play, even if it involved burning the stew or waking up with half a beat in your bed. These habits, these rituals, were the threads of our community passed down, misunderstood, and stubbornly repeated. We survived one crust, one cough, and one sacredly strange ritual at a time. And then there were the gatherings. Not the loud, boisterous kind with fiddles and barrels. No, this was quieter, sharper. Just after sunrise, a semicircle of old women would plant themselves by the village well, armed with shawls, strong tea, and tongues sharper than any sword. Their backs were hunched, but their hearing was impeccable. Their knees ached, but their memories were flawless, especially when it came to other people's worst moments. The well itself, sagging slightly to the left, seemed to listen in, creaking as if to add its own 2 cents to the gossip. A wooden bucket swung lazily on its rope, a silent confidant to their morning reports. Bertha was always first. A widow since the smaller flood, the one that only took out the pig shed. She'd arrived with oatcakes in a stained napkin, her lips already pursed, ready to pass judgment. Her gossip didn't warm up. It came out hot and fast. Did you see the baker's wife? She'd ask no one in particular. Wearing yellow. At her age. Bold. Martha, once a midwife, now a professional skeptic, would sniff, bold or desperate. Then Agnes, the smallest and perhaps most dangerous of the trio, would lean in, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. I heard, she'd say, that she's sweet on the cooper. Always asking for barrels she doesn't need. The wheel would creak in what sounded like agreement. Barrels she doesn't need, Bertha would repeat, tearing a piece of oatcake with unnecessary force. That's what got her sister in trouble, too. Always needing things she didn't. They'd all nod. A gesture carrying the weight of 4 decades of judging people who smiled too wide or enjoyed anything too much. Soon, a fourth would join them. Elsbeth limping slightly, dragging a tiny stool she claimed belonged to her late husband. She only spoke when she could no longer contain it. Today was one of those days. She sat, unfolded a suspiciously dry apple, and declared, I saw the priest leave the tavern last night with hay in his beard. A silence so heavy even the birds paused. With hay? Martha asked, her voice a fragile whisper. And a bruise on his forehead, Elsbeth added, taking a crisp bite of her apple. The oatcakes stopped mid-air. Agnes's small, bright eyes snapped wide, as if she'd just received a divine revelation. Well, Bertha said slowly, drawing out the word. He did give quite the sermon on temptation last week. Elsbeth chewed thoughtfully. We must all be tested, he said. Maybe he was just testing himself. A donkey brayed as it passed, but they paid it no mind. Their focus was now a laser beam on the priest, the cooper, the baker's wife, and the woman from 2 cottages down who was seen planting something in her garden after midnight. What sort of herb grows at that hour? Martha mused, eyebrows raised high. The sort that gets your chickens to lay twice as fast, Agnes muttered. The sort that gets your husband to speak less, Bertha added with a strategic sigh. Just then, a young girl approached the well, her eyes wide with a mixture of duty and fear. She greeted them with a quiet morning and reached for the heavy rope. Careful, Bertha warned, her voice a sharp command. That rope's seen better days. Much like the cooper's morals. The girl fumbled, her face flushing, as she began to haul the bucket. The women watched, their eyes like hawks. Their silence was a judgment in itself. That's Mary's youngest, isn't it? Agnes whispered. Poor thing. Always looks like she's about to spill something. Usually, a secret. Martha nodded. Her mother was the same. Couldn't keep a lid on a pot of soup, let alone a bit of news. The girl finally wrestled the full bucket onto the stone ledge, sloshing water onto her worn shoes. She scurried away without a backward glance, feeling their gazes on her back like a physical weight. Once she was gone, Bertha leaned forward again. The main event concluded. Now, about that herb, she began, her voice dropping an octave. I happen to know it wasn't an herb at all. It was a box, a small, wooden box. The circle tightened. The sun climbed higher, but the air by the well remained cool, thick with untold stories and the delicious, dangerous thrill of knowing, in our village, information wasn't just power. It was the most nourishing meal of the day, served fresh every morning. In the heart of the village, where the well served as both a source of water and a fountain of whispers, 3 women sat perched on a weathered bench. That rope frays more every day, Agnes observed, her voice as dry as the dusty path. And if it snaps, Martha added, a glint in her eye, you'll end up in the well and hear everything we said twice. A young girl, barely a woman, finished her task at the well. She nodded too quickly, nearly losing her grip on the crank. The moment the bucket hit the edge, she retreated, spilling half the water on her dress without so much as a backward glance. Agnes watched her go. That one's too quiet, she declared. Quiet ones always marry wrong, Elsbeth grunted, her gaze fixed on the distance. Quiet ones listen too much, she countered. Just like us. A rare moment of laughter followed. It wasn't the kind that shook shoulders, but a dry, dusty rustle that just stirred their shawls. They'd never admit it, but beneath the layers of judgment and oat crumbs, there was a kind of affection, a sisterhood forged not by love, but by repetition, survival, and the shared, unspoken understanding that everyone, eventually, gave them something to talk about. Their conversation shifted seamlessly, as it always did. The topic now was pigs. Apparently, the big one near the churchyard had gotten loose again. This time, it had managed to eat half a salter before someone chased it off with a broom. The women debated the theological implications. Did this make the pig holy or blasphemous? Elsbeth, ever the pragmatist, suggested it was probably both. And that, she added with a pointed look, makes it not so different from some men in this village. More oatcakes were passed around. Some were dipped in weak tea. Others simply gnawed on for something to occupy their hands. No one asked for the recipe. They all knew it. Oats, heat, and a healthy dose of mild resentment were the only ingredients required. By the time the sun was high enough to warm the edge of their bench, they had dissected the lives of nearly everyone in the village. They discussed who was limping too suddenly, who was smiling too often, and who had bought new ribbons they couldn't possibly afford. They weren't always right. They certainly weren't always fair. But they were always, unfailingly, watching, and they knew, as surely as the sun would rise, that tomorrow they would be back. Same time, same well, same oatcakes, and someone new to talk about. Meanwhile, inside the nearby manor, where the walls leaned ever so slightly as if tired of holding secrets, a young scribe sat hunched over a grand wooden desk. The desk was far too noble for his level of talent. His name was Lionel, though some in the manor had taken to calling him Blot. This wasn't a term of affection. It stemmed from an unfortunate incident involving a spilled inkwell and the bishop's pristine sleeve-on event no one had ever truly moved on from. Right now, Lionel was in his 5th hour of copying a legal charter. The document was so mind-numbingly dull, it could probably end wars just by being read aloud. It was written in Latin, a language that, for Lionel, triggered a very specific and peculiar response: sneezing. Not a metaphorical sneeze, but a full-blown, body-racking, sinus-clearing event. Something about the parchment, the ink, or perhaps the overwhelming scent of obligation, set his sinuses ablaze. He dipped his quill into the inkpot. It dripped. He carefully wiped the excess on a cloth that had once been white but now looked like it had survived 3 plagues and a minor exorcism. With the solemnity of a monk taking a vow, he began the next line. Ad universos, praesenti bus, ... double quotes, he mumbled, his hand poised, and then it happened. The sneeze erupted mid-word, splattering a tiny constellation of black ink across the pristine parchment. He froze, horrified. His nose now bore the unmistakable mark of a man who had fought and lost a duel with a squid. He sighed, looking at the ruined line. This was going to be a very, very long day. The gossipers, by the well, had their stories, but within the manor walls, Lionel was busy, unintentionally, creating his own. "Oh, for heaven's sake, ... double quotes, he muttered, blotting the page so aggressively the ink spread like gossip. The steward poked his head in. Progress. Lionel smiled like a man on the edge. By all appearances, good. That charter must be perfect. His lordship is having it read aloud at supper tonight. Lionel blinked. Read aloud. To people, to the bishop, the magistrate, and 3 nobles who understand less Latin than you. And he disappeared before Lionel could object. That was the thing. No one would understand it. Not the bishop, who mostly just nodded at things and blessed whatever was closest. Not the magistrate, who once mistook a recipe for a legal summons, and certainly not Lord Redgrave himself, who had insisted the document include a clause about goose ownership rights. Just in case, he'd said. Lionel sighed and began again. Somewhere in the hallway, a maid dropped a tray. The crash startled him, making him flick his quill like a wand, launching a stripe of ink across the floor, and onto a fat, ginger cat that had been napping far too peacefully under his stool. The cat woke up with a howl. launched itself onto the desk and skittered across the page, leaving inky paw prints like small declarations of war. Lionel froze. The cat froze. Both considered the consequences. "I didn't see anything," he whispered to it. The cat blinked, unimpressed, and left the room with the air of someone who had just ended a relationship. He stared at the ruined page, then at the previous 4, all of them smudged, blotted, or mysteriously sticky. One had a dead fly pressed between 2 lines, like punctuation. Another had a faint circle, where he'd once set his T without thinking. It wasn't that Lionel was bad at his job. He was just employed in a job that did not care for him. He liked poetry. He liked stories. He once tried to sneak a haiku into a land deed just to see if anyone would notice. They hadn't. But now, every time the town crier announced a parcel's boundaries, he accidentally recited a meditation on wind and wheat. Still, this charter had to be serious. Apparently, it concerned land use, taxation, and some clause about cows that sounded vaguely threatening. So Lionel tried again. He sat straighter. He wiped the ink from his nose. He dipped his quill carefully into the inkpot. He breathed through his mouth as if that might stop the sneezes that were always lurking, ready to ambush his perfect lettering. And he wrote, "Ad universus presentibus, bless you," came a voice from the hallway, preemptively. He didn't sneeze that time, but he did spill tea on his foot. Midway through the paragraph about grain levies, a thought began to form in his weary mind. He began to wonder if anyone in the manor actually read anything. The steward only ever glanced at the margins, checking for neatness. The lord just looked for his own name and any mention of ducks. The bishop pretended to squint as if he'd left his glasses in heaven. Maybe, Lionel thought, this wasn't about understanding. Maybe it was about performance. Maybe it was all about authority in long sentences, power in curled letters, and unnecessarily large wax seals. It was a show, and he was just the props master. He paused, a glint of mischief in his tired eyes. He wrote a new line, "Quibusdam terminus umbritus porca silentium," which meant, very roughly, in certain shaded circumstances, the pig rules the silence. He stared at it, a genuine smile spreading across his face for the first time all day. Then, with a heavy sigh, he reluctantly crossed it out. Mostly, by late afternoon, his desk was surrounded by a graveyard of crumpled parchment, a half-eaten oat biscuit, and a mouse that may or may not have been reading over his shoulder. His nose was inked again. His eyes were crossed from staring at the page. But the charter, finally, was done. He leaned back, listening to the distant sounds of the manor, preparing for supper, and wondered if anyone would notice the very faint, crossed-out line about the silent pig. Probably not. And that was a comfort and a private victory, all its own. Have you ever wondered what it was like to wake up on a freezing winter morning, not in a centrally heated house, but in a simple medieval cottage? Let us travel back in time and spend a day with a family in the Middle Ages to see how they truly survived the cold. As dawn breaks, the first thing on everyone's mind is the fire. It's the heart of the home, the only source of heat. Imagine William and Margaret huddled close, trying to chase away the bone-chilling cold that seeped through the wattle and door walls all night, while the youngest, Agnes, is still buried under a pile of woolen blankets. The day's work has already begun. The men, Thomas and William, have an urgent task. "We should check the roof," Thomas says. "A heavy blanket of snow has fallen overnight, and that's a serious threat." Their house has a thatched roof made of thick layers of straw. It's fantastic for insulation, keeping the cottage surprisingly warm. But too much heavy, wet snow could cause the entire roof to collapse. Most medieval houses had steep roofs designed to help the snow slide off, but a major blizzard like this one requires a manual clearing. It's a cold, dangerous job, but absolutely essential for the family's survival. While they're outside, Emma and Margaret get started on the first meal of the day. Don't picture a big breakfast spread with eggs and bacon. For most medieval people, life revolved around 2 main meals. The morning meal was a simple, energy-boosting affair. Today, it's a steaming pot of porridge, made from oats or barley. If they're lucky, they might have a spoonful of precious honey to sweeten it. This hearty, warm meal is crucial fuel for the hard physical labor ahead. It wasn't about enjoyment. It was about getting the calories needed to function in the cold. Now, how do you dress to go clear snow off a roof when there's no high-tech winter gear? Emma reminds William, put on your leg wrappings before you go outside. This is the secret to medieval warmth. Layers, layers, and more layers. And the star material, wool. Wool was the miracle fabric of the Middle Ages. Unlike cotton, which becomes useless and cold when wet, wool retains its insulating properties, even when damp. Thanks to its natural lanolin oils, it could keep you warm in the often wet, slushy winters of Northern Europe. It was a true lifesaver. For a common man like William, winter fashion was all about function. He'd start with a linen undertunic, then layer 1 or 2 woolen tunics on top. On his legs, he'd wear loose trousers or hose. But the real game changer was the leg wrappings. These were long strips of woolen cloth, wound tightly from the ankle all the way up to the knee. Think of them as a combination of socks, leg warmers, and extra insulation, all in one. They provided an incredible amount of warmth and protection. Women like Emma and Margaret also relied on layers. They would wear a long linen underdress, topped with 1 or more long woolen gowns. The more layers, the warmer you'd be. And what about your head and hands? A huge amount of body heat escapes through your head, a fact medieval people understood well. Both men and women would wear woolen caps, coifs, or hoods, often pulled up over their heads to keep the wind and cold out. And for their hands, they wore mittens, not gloves. It might seem like a small detail, but it was a clever design. Keeping your fingers together in a mitten shares their warmth, making it much more effective at preventing frostbite than separating each finger in a glove. It was all about practical, shared warmth. After the roof is cleared and the morning meal is eaten, the day is far from over. Winter wasn't a time for hibernation. It was a time for indoor work. The firelight would have been dim, supplemented only by the weak winter sun coming through a small, shuttered window glass was a luxury reserved for the very wealthy in churches. In this cozy, smoky interior, the family would turn to their winter tasks. The men might be repairing tools, carving wood, or mending leather harnesses. Every piece of equipment had to be in perfect shape for the spring planting season. Nothing could be wasted, and self-sufficiency was key. For the women, winter was the season for textiles. Emma and Margaret would spend countless hours spinning wool into thread using a drop spindle, a simple but effective tool. This thread would then be woven into cloth on a loom. Making fabric was an incredibly time-consuming process. The clothes they wore, the blankets on their beds, everything was the result of months, if not years, of female labor. It was a constant, rhythmic part of winter life. As the sun begins to set, which happens very early in the winter, preparations for the main meal of the day would begin. This was the biggest meal, eaten in the mid-afternoon. It might consist of a thick stew, called pottage, simmering over the fire all day. It would be filled with whatever vegetables they had stored from the harvest: onions, leeks, cabbage, and dried peas. They might add some salted or smoked meat if they had it. This one-pot meal was a complete and nourishing dinner. As darkness falls completely, the family gathers once more around the fire. There's no electricity, no books for entertainment for common folk. This was a time for storytelling, for passing down family histories and local legends. It was a time for connection, huddled together in the small bubble of warmth and light, with the deep, silent cold of the medieval winter just outside their door. Living through a medieval winter was a testament to human resilience and ingenuity. It was a life dictated by the seasons, where warmth was a constant effort and every resource was precious. Lionel wiped his hands on his tunic, stood up, and immediately, for the final time, knocked over the inkwell. He thought about screaming, he really did, but instead, he just whispered to the empty room, "I shall blame the cat." He rolled up the parchment, tied it with a bit of twine, and walked out of the room like a man who had just lost a battle, but knew, somehow, he would survive the war. Later that night, the charter would be read. It would be full of mispronunciations, completely misunderstood by everyone present, and by morning, it would be utterly forgotten. But somewhere, deep within its clauses, hidden in the dense legal jargon, a small smudge shaped, vaguely like a paw print, would remain. It was proof that at least two beings in this world had cared enough about this document to ruin it completely. The sun was barely up. The morning mist was still hanging around the fields like a group of gossips with nothing better to do. It was at this ungodly hour that Edwin was handed a bucket, a rag, and a mission. A mission that would haunt him for seasons to come. "Go, milk Gertrude," the stable master had said, wiping his hands on his apron as if he were bestowing upon Edwin some ancient, sacred honor. "She's in a mood today," he added. "Be gentle." Edwin knew this was a lie. Gertrude was always in a mood. Sometimes, that mood was a sleepy, unimpressed disdain. Other times, it was outright war. She was, in fact, the only cow in the entire village with her own nickname among the children, the Throne of Doom. Her stare, a flat, glassy, amber thing, had been known to make grown men seriously reconsider their life choices and career paths. Still, Edwin nodded like a fool and accepted the task. He did this mostly because saying no would have meant scrubbing the latrines instead, and milking a demonic cow seemed like the lesser of two evils. At 16, Edwin was an apprentice in everything and a master of absolutely nothing. He was the kind of person who had once managed to trip over his own shoe while standing perfectly still. And today, he was about to learn how to milk a cow. This was going to go well. He approached the barn with the kind of reverence a man usually reserves for entering a battlefield. Birds chirped cheerfully overhead, completely oblivious to the impending doom. In the distance, the rooster finally let out a crow, as if to say, "Oh, this is going to be good." Inside, there she was, Gertrude. She stood like a statue, carved from pure indignation and bits of hay. She didn't look at Edwin. She looked through him, into the very soul of his incompetence. Her eyes narrowed. Her tail gave a sharp, threatening flick. "Morning," Edwin said softly, trying his best to sound confident, and not like a lamb being led to the slaughter. "I'm here to you know." The milking. Gertrude, of course, didn't respond. She just shifted her weight slightly, a movement that could have meant "come closer, my friend," or "prepare to meet your maker." It was genuinely hard to tell with her. He placed the bucket gently on the floor beneath her. He then sat on the milking stool, which wobbled precariously if you so much as breathed too hard. With trembling hands, he reached out. He'd been told the technique, of course, thumb and forefinger, then squeeze with the rest of the fingers, sort of like squeezing a pouch of mead. But the reality was different. Her udders felt like warm, twitchy balloons, and just the simple act of touching them made him flinch. "Sorry," he whispered to Gertrude, as if apologizing for his very existence. Gertrude's response was a sneeze. A wet, comprehensive, explosive sneeze that landed directly on Edwin's face, blinking away the dot. Well, whatever that was, Edwin wiped his eyes and tried again. He gave one slow, cautious tug. Nothing. He tried another. Still nothing. He looked up at her face, and he could have sworn Gertrude was chewing her cud slowly, staring at him with a smirk that really shouldn't have been possible on a cow's face. "Right," Edwin muttered to himself, taking a deep breath. Round 2. He repositioned himself on the wobbly stool, took another handful of the surprisingly warm udder, and tried to remember the stable master's instructions. "Gentle but firm," he'd said. "Show her who's boss." Showing Gertrude who was boss felt about as plausible as teaching a fish to climb a tree. He tried again, this time with a bit more conviction. He squeezed, and this time a thin, pathetic trickle of milk hit the side of the bucket with a sad little ping, success. Sort of, encouraged, he tried again, a little more rhythmically. Ping, ping, plink. He was getting the hang of it. He was a milker, a master of the bovine arts. He was Gertrude, shifted her weight again, this time with more purpose. The wobbly stool wobbled with more purpose. Edwin, in a desperate attempt to stay upright, leaned a little too far to the left. His elbow bumped Gertrude's leg. It was a small touch, insignificant, but to Gertrude, it was a declaration of war. She let out a low, rumbling moo that sounded less like a farm animal and more like a gathering storm. Then, with a speed that defied her size, she swung her head around and fixed him with that soul-piercing amber stare. Her tail began to whip back and forth like a metronome, counting down to his demise. Edwin froze. His hands were still on her udder. The bucket was half full of his hard-won, slightly sneeze-covered milk. He knew he was in a precarious situation. He could try to slowly back away, or he could make a run for it. He chose a third option, doing absolutely nothing and hoping she'd forget he was there. This was a poor choice. Gertrude took a step. It wasn't a big step, but it was enough to knock the wobbly stool completely out from under him. Edwin landed hard on the hay-strewn floor with a surprised oof. The bucket, miraculously, stayed upright for about a second. Then, Gertrude, with the precision of a seasoned duelist, kicked it. Not a wild, angry kick. It was a calm, deliberate, perfectly aimed kick. The bucket sailed through the air in a graceful arc, spraying its milky contents all over the barn wall, Edwin's hair, and a very surprised-looking chicken that had wandered in to see what all the fuss was about. Edwin just lay there, covered in milk, hay, and shame. Gertrude looked down at him, chewed her cud once more, and then let out a soft, almost contented moo. She had one. As always. From the barn door, the stablemaster's voice floated in. "Having trouble, lad?" He was leaning against the frame, a huge grin on his face. "Told you she was in a mood." Edwin just sighed, a long, drawn-out sound of utter defeat. The rooster crowed again, as if for an encore. Today, Edwin had learned how to milk a cow. Or rather, he had learned how to milk Gertrude. And he had a sinking feeling that tomorrow's lesson would involve scrubbing latrines after all. As he picked himself up, dripping and dejected, he knew one thing for sure. The throne of doom remained The sun had yet climbed too far into the sky when the village children were released into the fields. The adults gave them a task they generously called important work. This was important, mostly in the sense that it kept them out of the bakery, away from the priest, and preferably far from anything breakable. Their official mission, to gather weeds from the edge of the barley rows. They were also given a few simple rules. Don't hit each other with shovels. Don't climb the scarecrow again. And for goodness sake, don't pretend to die in front of travelers. These requests were, of course, understood in the moment, but not necessarily remembered for longer than a few seconds. A dozen or so children spilled into the fields like a flock of noisy birds, armed with small shovels, baskets, and the kind of chaotic energy that makes even goats nervous. Their clothes were a patchwork of repairs, their shoes were uneven, and their priorities were crystal clear. Dig something up, throw it at someone, and if possible, fall down dramatically afterward. It was a simple, effective plan for a day's entertainment. Thomas, at the ripe old age of 9 and already missing 2 front teeth from 2 separate, unrelated, and entirely predictable incidents, declared himself commander of dirt. He immediately appointed a council, which consisted of whichever children hadn't already run away when he started shouting. His first decree was to form a shovel brigade. "You dig, you duck, and if you get hit, you scream," he announced proudly, gripping his own shovel like a knight holding a very flat and very muddy sword. Marigold, the oldest at nearly 12 and far too intelligent for this environment, rolled her eyes so hard it nearly counted as a full-body exercise. She was supposed to be supervising this whole operation. Instead, she found herself ducking as a rotten turnip flew past her ear. "That was a warning shot," yelled a boy named Pip, who was never entirely sure what he was warning anyone about, but he was committed to the role. And just like that, the battle began. This was not a battle for land, or for glory, or for honor. It was a battle against boredom. It was a competition for attention, a contest to see who could yell, "I've been struck," with the most theatrical flair while crumpling to the earth like a wounded bard. Soon, the field was a whirlwind of activity. Turnips became ammunition. Clumps of damp soil transformed into makeshift grenades. Sticks were suddenly powerful staffs, and someone even fashioned a helmet out of a cracked bucket and half a bird's nest. It was a masterpiece of resourcefulness. At one point, a girl named Elsie lay face down in the grass, arms spread wide, murmuring to the wind, "Tell my goat I loved her," as if breathing her final words. It was a moving performance, and no one questioned its authenticity. A younger boy, barely 5, wandered through the middle of the chaos with a dandelion crown on his head, completely oblivious to the war raging around him. He was gently struck by a flying potato, which caused him to sit down and quietly contemplate his life choices. Nearby, 2 boys engaged in what could only be described as a grand duel. Their flat shovels clanged together with the precision of a tired blacksmith and the strategic wisdom of a brick. The clash was short-lived. One of them tripped over his own feet. The other declared a glorious victory and immediately began chanting a victory song made entirely of made-up words. Everyone applauded, then booed for dramatic effect, then applauded again just to be safe. A nearby farmer, hoe in hand, looked up just once from his furrows. He surveyed the beautiful chaos, noted that no one was actively on fire, and then, with a silent shrug, returned to his work. He had seen worse. Last spring, they'd stolen a wheelbarrow and raced it downhill straight into the river. One of them had somehow emerged from the water riding a very surprised goose, like a chariot. After that, he learned not to ask too many questions. Meanwhile, the actual purpose of their important work was long forgotten. The weed baskets remained mostly empty. The shovels, once intended for gentle tilling, were now covered in dents, mud, and possibly one very regrettable snail. No one had gathered anything remotely useful, except for a curious clump of moss that someone insisted was magical and immediately tucked into their pocket for good luck. Marigold, having completely given up on shouting instructions, began building a tower of rocks in silent protest. At least it was productive. It was a small monument to order in a world of pure, unadulterated childhood mayhem. The sun continued its climb, the children continued their war, and the weeds continued to grow, blissfully undisturbed by the so-called important work of the village's youngest residents. And as the day wore on, their energy finally began to wane. The dramatic final stands became less frequent, the ammunition ran low, and the commander of Dirt found himself leading an army of tired, muddy soldiers who were more interested in finding a shady spot to rest. The great battle for nothing was over. They trudged back towards the village, empty baskets in hand, covered in glory and dirt, leaving the field in a state of peaceful disarray. They had accomplished absolutely nothing they were sent to do, but in their own way, they had accomplished everything that truly mattered. For a while, the dirt mound reached an impressive height, a monument to their shared chaos. It stood proudly until someone, in a moment of brilliant strategic thinking, mistook it for an enemy fortress and demolished it with a single well-aimed parsnip. The war, you see, was a serious business. There was one brief, shining moment of truce. A hush fell over the battlefield when someone announced they'd found a rabbit hole. Everyone gathered around, their eyes wide and reverent, a silent congregation hoping for a glimpse of floppy ears. The rabbit, wisely, did not appear. Instead, a new battle began. What to name it? Suggestions were shouted with the gravity of naming a king. Sir Flop, Mud King, Dirt Jesus. No decision was reached. Of course, that would have required far too much cooperation. As the sun climbed higher, it cast long, dramatic shadows over the field. Children lay sprawled everywhere, like tiny, fallen soldiers, clutching their sides and gasping with laughter. They were gloriously filthy, stained with grass, dust, and several other substances that were probably best left unidentified. Their hands were blistered from digging, their hair was a tangled mess of burrs, and their faces glowed with the pure, unadulterated satisfaction of a good, completely pointless fight. Then, a faint bell rang from the village square. Lunchtime. A collective groan echoed across the field. It wasn't that they weren't hungry, they were ravenous. It was just that the war had been getting really good. Still, they rose, shaking off the dirt and the honor of battle, and began their slow retreat back through the fields. Thomas walked with a theatrical limp, he absolutely did not have 10 minutes earlier. Marigold carried a single, wilting weed in her basket, a symbolic trophy of her efforts. Pip clutched a lump of turnip like it was a golden idol. And watching them all pass was Gertrude the cow, her expression one of deep, bovine judgment. Back in the fields, the overturned soil bore the scars of a morning well wasted. There were tiny footprints everywhere, broken roots, and the scattered remains of vegetables that had been bravely pressed into service as weapons. The weeds still stood tall, but so did the stories. Midday in the village didn't arrive with a grand announcement or a whistle. It arrived in the stomach. It was a grumbling, a growling, a small, hollow echo that sounded like a cave when you poked it. It arrived in the way a man would wipe the sweat from his brow, glance at the sun, and desperately hope it was late. Enough to justify chewing on anything, even if it had a bit of bark in it. Lunch, as a concept, was often more of a hope than a plan. Some families prepared for it like a sacred ritual, with pots bubbling and tables set. Others stumbled into it like a trap, suddenly realizing hours had passed. And for many, especially the children, lunch was simply whatever you could catch, find, or chew fast enough that no one else could question where you got it. Down at the bakery, the little bread that remained from the morning rush was crusted and hard. It was only slightly warm if you held it under your armpit for long enough, a trick the baker's apprentice had perfected. He gnawed on a slice while pretending to sweep the floor, the taste a familiar mix of flour, smoke, and quiet apology. Out in the pasture, a heated argument broke out between three boys over the last scoop of stew in a shared wooden bowl. The stew was a suspicious shade of gray. No one could quite remember what had gone into it. One swore it was turnip. Another insisted it had been beetroot. The third just muttered, "bones," and refused to elaborate any further. They decided the only fair way to settle the dispute was a race to the nearest tree and back. The winner, gasping for breath, choked down the mysterious stew, while the other two watched, with a strange mixture of envy and genuine concern for his well-being. By the village well, an old woman carefully unwrapped the cloth to reveal a hunk of cheese, so aged it seemed to have developed its own personality, and possibly a faint pulse. It smelled powerfully of foot and defiance. She cut a piece with a knife that had clearly seen better centuries, popped it into her mouth, and declared it tangy, which was a very generous description. A stray dog sat nearby, its eyes full of hope. She offered it a tiny crumb. The dog sniffed it once, turned its nose up, and trotted away. Even the dog had standards. Not far away, a little girl with a smudge of dirt on her chin and a crown of daisies in her hair was on a mission. With the stealth of a cat, she tugged a plump, red radish straight from someone else's garden. She held it up to the sun, a jewel won through cunning and bravery, before taking a crunchy, satisfying bite. The taste was sharp, earthy, and victorious. This was lunch in its truest form, a small, perfect moment of triumph. And in that moment, for that little girl, it was the most delicious thing in the entire world. What a day, right? It just goes to show you that the best memories are often made in the mud, with a bit of chaos and a lot of laughter. Have you ever wondered what people ate for lunch, say, a few hundred years ago? Forget avocado toast and meal prep boxes. Let us take a little trip back in time to a world where lunch was less about cuisine and more about creativity, survival, and a little bit of mischief. Imagine this. A girl looks both ways, a stolen radish in her hand. She takes a bite. It's peppery, sharp, and tastes like a secret. She wipes her mouth on her sleeve, saves the other half for later, and skips off, a little criminal with no regrets. In the village tavern, there's food, but only if you have coin. Most don't, but the tavern keeper's son, he's a soft touch. He sees a widow with wide, sad eyes and slips her to boiled eggs and a slice of pie that has seen better days. She claims she hasn't eaten since Tuesday. It's Thursday. As she leaves, she gives him a sly wink. Some meals were, well, let's call them found. A boy named Lyle shows up with a squirrel, swearing he found it already like that. His grand plans for a roast are cut short by his mother, who snatches it and buries it under the herbs, muttering about curses. Lyle has to settle for a handful of sour sorrel and an apple he dropped twice. It's not squirrel, but it's something. Over by the church steps, two girls are taking turns licking honey off a twig. They insist the twig, laden with honeycomb, just fell off the beekeeper's fence. It didn't, of course, but they're quick, and the beekeeper is old. So, the honey now belongs to fate, and to them. They giggle between licks, dipping their fingers into the jar they definitely didn't steal, but merely adopted. Then there's the apprentice blacksmith, covered in soot and bursting with pride. He's munching on a roasted onion like it's a delicacy. No bread, no salt, just pure, pungent onion. He calls it warrior seasoning, and the fact that it creates a 6-foot personal bubble around him is a bonus. On the edge of the woods, an old man stirs a pot over a fire. No one knows what's in it. He never says. Sometimes he whistles. Sometimes he just stares into the pot, as if it's telling him the secrets of the universe. Someone once got a quick peek and saw what looked like a bird's foot and maybe a pear. Nobody ever dared to ask him about it. But it wasn't all stolen or mysterious. In a small, humble cottage, a mother hands out slices of oat cake and boiled carrots. She calls each of her children by name, treating them like honored guests at a royal banquet. The food is simple, but the children's faces shine with joy. One little boy even gives a formal bow before taking a bite of his carrot. His mother, playing along, curtsies in return. It's a reminder that how you eat can be just as important as what you eat. As the mealtime progresses, the air fills with the sounds of life, chewing, slurping, and a little argument over who got to lick the cheese rind first. It's not elegant. It's definitely not clean, but it is lunch. Out on the road, travelers make do. A man pauses his journey to eat a handful of roasted barley from a pouch at his belt. It tastes like burnt earth, but it's fuel, and he doesn't complain. Another traveler gnaws on the hard heel of bread he's been saving. He even offers a piece to his mule, who, apparently having higher standards, turns it down. And what about those with nothing at all? A group of children plays a game with a walnut shell and a couple of pebbles, pretending it's a magnificent feast. One mimes drinking hot soup from an imaginary bowl. Another declares her pebble is too spicy. They all agree, laughing, that it's the best lunch they've never had. Their imaginations fill their bellies when food cannot. Slowly, as the afternoon wears on, the village quiets down. Bellies are full, or at least no longer rumbling. Crumbs are swept away, and people return to their work with the quiet satisfaction of having made it through another meal. Because in this world, it didn't really matter what the food was, or where it came from. If you could find it, catch it, grow it, or even bluff your way into getting it, then it was lunch. And in a life where every day was a struggle, having lunch was more than enough. It was a victory.